Hermione Granger and the Philosopher's Stone, Chapter 2, The Flickering Lights. Just over 11 years had passed since the Grangers welcomed baby Hermione to her family. For the first few years of Hermione's life, both her parents were utterly terrified something bad would happen. To their relief, the only remote bad thing that happened was that one regrettable time Hermione decided to play dentist on her teddy bear and cried bloody murder when the plaster wouldn't come off its fur. Hermione was certainly a Granger. There was no denying it. As soon as she learned to talk, at an age much younger than her peers, thank you very much, Hermione always had something to say. The people of Lavenham, Suffolk, would hear her coming long before they saw her. Bert and Mary couldn't get to the library fast enough to keep up with Hermione's reading habits. She devoured books at a rate most adults couldn't even comprehend. For her 5th birthday, Mildred the librarian gave Hermione her very own library card, which frankly outshined the multitude of presents her parents got her that year, including the very realistic junior dentist kit. At 6 years old, Hermione became the youngest ever library assistant and took her weekend shifts very seriously. Townspeople laughed that the only time Hermione wasn't talking was when she was working in the library, unless she was chastising them for talking themselves. Hermione always, even from a very young age, seemed to feel different from everyone. She felt as though there was something missing and tried desperately, in her own little way, to fill the void with books and knowledge. Her parents were lovely but always seemed distant, only adding to her differentness. Watching her schoolmates and the other children of Lavenham from the top of her book, she noticed how different their parents seemed to treat them. Whereas they earned their parents' affection from immature and mundane feats of strength or silliness, Bert and Mary Granger only seemed interested in Hermione's newest fact of the day or the spelling of a particularly difficult word. She soon replaced her need to feel loved with a need to learn anything and everything. It seemed to fill a small part of that void. Any emotion that would pop up that Hermione didn't understand or couldn't control would be suppressed with a new fact or hypothesis to prove. Facts and hypotheses were much easier to deal with than emotions. Hermione also had a very strict understanding for all rules and laws. To her, rules were there for a reason, and even if you didn't know the reason, it was quite important. Maintaining the status quo and following the rules were very important for a civilized society. Without rules, there would be chaos, and Hermione hated chaos. Everything would have a place and a reason. It wasn't that Bert and Mary didn't love their daughter with all of their heart. They certainly did and would share a smile at every milestone Hermione would overcome, whether it be academic or not. Unfortunately, the nurse's theory that they were still in shock and therefore not completely bonding with their new daughter wasn't exactly true. Jean was a silent but ever-present barrier between Hermione and the Grangers, not only in name, but also in practice as well. Mary hated herself for it, but couldn't help but compare Hermione to the essence of what Jean could have been. Maybe that's what fed Hermione's subconscious feeling of never being smart enough or happy enough or good enough. And perhaps the lack of expression of feelings in the Granger's cottage made empathy and emotions the only subjects Hermione couldn't master. Not much had changed about Hermione's appearance in the 11 years since she had been born. Her hair was as fluffy as ever, and her dark brown eyes shone in the darkness. She had very large teeth, much to her dismay. Unfortunately, the junior dentist kit didn't have the proper tools for Hermione to fix them, and her parents flat out refused. A lot of her schoolmates in primary school made fun of her, which was obviously against the rules. She told herself That was why she got so upset at their mockery. They were breaking the bullying rules in school. Hermione couldn't let herself think their words may just have hurt her feelings instead, because then she'd have to admit to having feelings and caring what other people thought. The Grangers had set aside an old exam room as Hermione's work office when she wasn't at the library, but there were unfortunately no windows. Nonetheless, it always seemed abnormally bright in that room when Hermione was there. Hermione had her office set up quite practically. Opposite the door was her desk, with two chairs for any patients who needed a consultation. The desk was comprised of an old instrument table as low as it could go. On the left were old shelves filled with her current favorite books. On the top shelf, accessible by a step ladder, stowed away between the shelf and the wall, were all of the dentistry books her parents owned. Though there were times Hermione didn't need to set up the ladder, the books she wanted always seemed to tip and fall into her hands. Hermione was sure to refresh her dentistry knowledge on the off chance her parents had to come in to look something up. Hermione could beat them to it by answering their question. She loved to be helpful and relished in the look of approval her parents would give her when she answered their question. Below the dentistry books were various history and math books. Hermione would quite frequently pull down various historical texts and construct a narrative in her head about the events consisting of kings, queens, wizards, witches, and various creatures. Though she was quite brilliant, Hermione definitely had a very active imagination. She had to have one, she thought, because sometimes the stories in the history book didn't really add up. When she recalled her stories to her parents and the townspeople, she stuck to the facts. In her work office, however, she imagined the gaps being filled in with mysterious circumstances like dragons or magic wands. She would have been embarrassed for her parents to hear her stories, but they always filled her with so much joy. Plus, their additions made the stories make more sense. The bottom three shelves were a carousel of her favorite books, which changed from moment to moment. One of Hermione's favorite activities growing up was selecting a book to read aloud to all of her stuffed animal patients in her office. If she was particularly bored, she tried to make the pages flip on their own. When they did, which was not all the time, Hermione would smugly smile at her patients and nod her head. "See, my brain is quite powerful," she said, and then got back to the lesson. The other three walls, not occupied by the large shelves, were painted in a dull, dreary pinkish color that made Hermione cringe. It reminded her of the color of dehydrated and anesthetized gums and made her slightly shudder every time she entered the room. To combat the dreadful color, Hermione hung up all of the worksheets and illustrations she made for her class of stuffed animals so they could follow along with her lessons without being offended by the color. One particularly horrible day, Hermione walked into her work office and threw her knapsack into the corner of the room, knocking some of her students over. "Primary school is the worst, the absolute worst," she exclaimed, near to tears, to no one in particular. "Those children think I'm an absolute freak until it's time for an exam, and then they want to be my best friend. And now," she paused, holding back tears, "and now I won't receive any credit for my grammar exam because the professor thinks I was letting them cheat off my test." Hermione broke down in heaving sobs as the full weight of the situation fell upon her. Having never received less than full marks in her whole academic career, Hermione would not only have this horrendous grade on her record until she died, but she also knew 0 marks had to be signed off by a parent or guardian. Her sobs intensified so much that she didn't notice the lights slightly dimming and the papers on the walls ruffling in a wind that wasn't really there. How could she possibly tell her parents she was not going to get her usual perfect marks? Hermione couldn't even begin to imagine their disappointment in her. Her anxiety wouldn't stop. She had absolutely no idea how to control the tears streaming down her face or the sobs shaking her shoulders. Hermione tried everything she could think of to stop, but everything she could think of wasn't much. No amount of facts or figures were going to help keep this at bay. Her hands started to clam up, and her chest felt as though 1,000 elephants were sitting on it. Her breaths got more and more shallow. Mary had just finished up with a patient when she noticed the lights dimming in the hall outside of her exam rooms. Taking it as a sign that it was time to head home for the day, she went to retrieve her daughter from the extra exam room down the hall. As she walked down the hall, 5 charts in hand, she was too preoccupied to hear the hiccuping sobs radiating from her daughter's exam room. She opened the door with a gasp. There was her 11-year-old daughter, sitting on the floor with her legs crossed underneath her, rocking back and forth as if having an adult-sized panic attack. The charts nearly tumbled out of her arms. It was very rare for her daughter to show any emotion other than an intense eagerness to learn. Mary was at a complete loss as what to do. Hermione, she said tentatively. Hermione gasped and looked up, her big brown eyes red and swollen. The terror of letting her mother see her fail, both academically and in a ridiculous show of emotion, pulsed through her body. This was not how she was expected to act. The shame crushed what little was left of her resolve. Mom, she gasped. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to keep you. Let me gather my things and I will. Hermione, calm down. What happened? Why are you crying like this? Mary asked, looking like a deer caught in headlights. Her tone was a mixture of confusion and fear, though Hermione only heard anger. Oh, I just. Hermione started but couldn't form the words. One of the only coping methods Hermione had developed when she felt herself having a panic attack was to just combat it with a stream of random facts that may or may not be connected to what was upsetting her, but that wasn't working. Deep down, she knew this wasn't a way to actually solve the problem, and was angry with herself for not being able to figure it out. But it was the only way she could make it stop sometimes. Word vomit, she'd call it with loathing. Instead of word vomit, however, she just grabbed her knapsack and rushed out of the room past Mary, who hadn't moved. Hermione couldn't bear to let her mother down like that. She turned and watched her daughter run down the hall. Her heart broke. She realized for the first time that she had absolutely no idea how to fix this situation. Mary didn't really know enough about her daughter to guess what was happening, and the thought terrified her. How could she not be an expert on her own daughter? A flip seemed to switch inside her. For the first time in 10 years, Mary didn't have a lingering thought of Jean. She could only think of her daughter, Hermione. Mary tossed the charts aside and followed her daughter down the hall. Hermione was waiting near the front door of the office facing the wall. Her knapsack was the only giveaway she was still crying. It was jiggling up and down with her sobs. She started at the wall, trying desperately to think of something that would calm her down, but nothing came. Hermione tried to count the bumps on the wall, but kept losing track of the numbers. She could feel the panic building up all over again. What was this? Was she going to die? All sense of reason and apprehension left Mary as she silently stood behind her daughter. Without thinking, she wrapped her arms around Hermione and held her tightly. Hey, she whispered. Hey, love. It's going to be okay. Whatever it is, It's going to be okay. The words naturally came out of Mary's mouth without any thought. It was as if instinct took over. Hermione was too shocked to argue that it was not, in fact, okay. A first for her as well. Hermione had no idea what to do, both because of the panic attack and this weird behavior from her mother. There was nothing to do but shrink into her mother's arms. She physically couldn't do anything else. Hermione tried desperately not to let her mind continue to snowball, but thankfully, every time it did, her mother's grasp seemed to get tighter. The two sat there until Hermione eventually calmed down enough to tell her about her bad marks. She mixed in a rumbling of random facts about completely unrelated things in between the emotional story. It was always much easier to talk about facts than feelings. Rationally, Hermione knew it was a coping mechanism that perhaps wasn't the best, but at least it helped her to get the story out. Don't you worry another minute about it, Mary said. I will go and have a little chat with your teacher and get this all straightened out, darling. Hermione had never been called darling before. She just stared at her mother, wondering quite frankly, where was all of this coming from? It was also almost magical. For the first time in her life, Hermione felt accepted for something other than her smarts. Mary took Hermione to the local ice cream parlor down the street from the office. They both giggled like schoolgirls as they tried to balance the 4 scoops of ice cream on each of their cones. Prancing home, Mary and Hermione waved at all of the other townspeople enjoying the warm weather. Most had to do a double take to make sure they were seeing it correctly. There was a voice in Hermione's head telling her this was all temporary, but a warm feeling that grew throughout the day and kept it a whisper. Bert, having left work early for a doctor's appointment of his own, was waiting in the Granger cottage for his wife and daughter to get home. He kept glancing at his watch, watching the minutes and eventually hours tick by. He had made a very sensible dinner, shepherd's pie, and was very worried it would be completely dried out by the time the two got home. He was just about to find a cookbook to see if there were any remedies he could manage in the meantime when the door burst open. We've decided we should go camping this weekend, Mary said with a giggle. Hermione has never been. What do you think of the first of Dean, dear? Yeah, Dad. What about it? Hermione asked with a huge smile.